Hello and welcome to PMI's Uncommon Sense podcast, tools to improve your work forever. I'm Susanna Clark, managing partner with PMI. Our Uncommon Sense podcast is a 15-minute conversation with our expert consultants. They talk a lot of common sense, although much of it is not common practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. We want you to be inspired to improve your business through learning more about the tools which can help you succeed and grow. Today, I'm joined by Damion, Albinson, and we're going to talk about PDSA and disconfirming evidence. Before we get into PDSA and disconfirming evidence, could you just, for anyone who's listening who's not familiar with PDSA, could you just give a brief introduction to that?
Yeah, so PDSA is, I guess, rather than just call it a tool, I'm not comfortable with that. It's more of a kind of a principle and a thinking model, as I often describe it. It's a model that actually describes the approach as to how we should think, especially when we're trying to, well, in the context of business improvement, when we're trying to describe what's causing a problem, which is what most business improvement techniques are trying to do, or people believe they found a solution to something, which is also, of course, very common in business improvement. I mean, that's the whole thing. So, and this model is central to, well, how should we approach that in a robust way, in almost a scientific approach? So yeah, that's what PDSA is. Plan, do, study, act is what the initial stuff.
And I always enjoy the note that it doesn't begin with plan. So even though we call it PDSA and it's plan, do, study, act, you don't start with plan.
So it comes down to what the cycle is about. So the cycle is really asking us to do, of course, four things. It's saying, okay, formulate a hypothesis on something, right? Which would be back to the context of business improvement. This is, I have a theory on this that caused this issue, or I have a solution. Okay. So both of those could be described as hypotheses, right? They're not true and they're not false until we've tested them, which is the next part, the do. So we have to go and do some kind of experiment to find out with data and measures and making predictions. We then study those results and then we choose how we're going to act. So we're going to keep that theory, we're going to change it slightly, test it again, or we're going to reject it, we're going to abandon it. So this idea of study being before we jump into hypotheses or theories says, well, how can you have a hypothesis on anything if you haven't already studied it in some way, if you haven't looked at some data or experienced that process firsthand or something like that, so if I were to wander into your business and say, I know what can improve your profit margin straight away, you just need to do this, this, and this. Although some clients might expect me to do things like that as a consultant, I haven't experienced your business. I don't know what the variables and factors are in play that could affect those sorts of things. So I could give you a theory. Of course, anyone can create a theory, a hypothesis based on nothing. Chances of them being correct are less so if I haven't already done that initial groundwork. So that's why we say, certainly for the first iteration of PDSA, how have you studied this situation? What data do you have? What information do you have? They're going to lead to much better hypotheses, which is why we always say many project structures always involve the people who operate that process. For that exact reason, they have that daily, probably years worth of experience of that process. They're going to give you some fantastic theories, hypotheses. Let me keep the language the same. Hypotheses.
So when you say, well, I want to work PDSA and disconfirming evidence, that immediately seems slightly, well, surely we're looking for evidence. We're looking for evidence about the hypotheses, as you suggested, that these are good hypotheses. We should have a go at doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so herein lies the kind of subtlety with this model that's often not taught very well in my experience when I see other people or even literature that describes this particular model. I think over the years it's been, shared and repopulated by so many people. The kind of its originality has been somewhat diluted. And so, when we're talking about the experimental part, that we need to do some kind of test to test our hypothesis, right? Is it reliable or not? It's the type of evidence we're looking for, and we're actually looking for what we call disconfirming evidence. So the best way to think about it is if you come up with some hypothesis and you've made a prediction, what you're expecting is going to happen when we test it, the way in which you test it, and this is how I describe it to people, you're setting up an experiment in such a way that you're trying to disprove it. You're trying to destroy your own hypothesis. You're trying to
Hmm.
find something that says, can I show that this doesn't work, that this isn't true? And if I fail to find that evidence, it means with the right test conditions, it means that this hypothesis probably is reliable in some way. We can use it and we can keep using it. So, and that's the subtlety, I think. It's this side, because like you say, from certainly when I was in school and in lessons like science and so on, and if you watch TV about police dramas or crime or all this kind of stuff, we're kind of enveloped in this idea of looking for proof. You've got to find the evidence to show that something's true.
Mm.
We don't often hear it this way, that says in a scientific based approach, what you're doing is actually the opposite. You're trying to show that it's not correct in some way.
Yes.
And if you think about it, if you know anything about, for those listeners that know about science, of course, this is how science works. That's why you have things like peer review before people are allowed to publish, white papers on new facets of science.
And there's that piece of almost, of course, it's blindingly obvious, because if we're looking for, can we prove, if you like, that it doesn't work? If we didn't do that, we'd only be putting off the inevitable, wouldn't we? Because inevitably, if there is a failure opportunity within something, it's going to come up just after you've implemented it, or at
Yes,
some point when it's really important in the future. So it's so much better actually to look at the opportunity for it to fail, because you can then eliminate it early and just say, well, no, that's no good for us, because we don't want something that fails. We want something that works.
absolutely. Yeah. You want to be finding these things out so you can kind of stamp them out and say, look,
Yeah.
this is the great thing about PDSA, because it's a model for learning. This approach gives us the basis on which we're going to learn. Okay. So there's even a saying that says, if every hypothesis you ever had, were to always be correct, then what have you actually learned? Because all you've really done is validated what you already knew. So
Yeah.
it's when we disprove what we thought sounded perfectly plausible, that's when the real learning's happening, because it says there's something wrong with our thinking. We believe that X causes Y. We've done an experiment and it says, no, it doesn't. That gets very interesting. This is where,
Yeah.
so that's one of the things I like about PDSA, because it's this, because I think without that, you've got this almost cultural thing about being right. You're the manager, Susanna. Something's gone wrong. You better damn well have the answer, right? If I'm looking at you, if I'm the bigger boss,
Yeah.
right? Wouldn't that be interesting? And of course, there's this almost like embarrassment. I think this is why people even look for proof. If they've attempted to describe what's caused some issue, because there's this fear of being wrong. I want to be seen to be correct all the time.
Yes.
Even if that's a fear of what other people might think, or even our own egos. We don't like necessarily to be wrong about anything, because it kind of,
But there
we
is,
think in our heads we should have known.
yeah, and but there is something intoxicating about feeling you've got a great idea. It does make you feel good. You go, oh, that's exciting, and so therefore you really want that to be right. The idea,
Yes,
and
of
you want people
course.
to adopt
Yeah,
it
yeah,
and do it, because that's
yeah.
again really enforces that good feeling we have that we've done something great.
It does,
So
and that's maybe what can get in the way sometimes. It's
yeah,
our own egos getting in the way of. They call it confirmation bias, don't they? It's that we're so biasly one way on something
yeah,
that we even sometimes intentionally or sometimes unintentionally ignore data or information or facts that contravene that idea. So there's a lot to talk about in this model. There's a lot of
yeah.
stuff and if you thought that it was as simple as plan to do something, do it, study it, and just act and do the next thing, it's actually not quite that straightforward. There are some real nice subtleties with PDSA.
So I can imagine talking to somebody, and whilst logically this sounds great, does it slow you down? Is there anything that help people feel more confident that this actually is a way there is a way of getting good progress through this?
I think you're right in that you can't PDSA everything. I think practically in a business environment, it just wouldn't be wise to do that. I think you've got to pick and choose, the moments when we're going to use this. One thing that can speed it up is sometimes you already have the disconfirming evidence. You don't even need to do a test.
Right.
Sometimes you can look back at your recent history of stuff and see that certain theories that have been put on the table, certain hypotheses that have been put on the table are false.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, how could we have gotten these results we've had in the past? If someone
Yeah.
says, oh yeah, the reason we've got all these problems is it's because of that new starter that joined last month. Well, hang on a minute. We had these problems prior to them joining.
Yes.
So there's something wrong immediately with that hypothesis. So sometimes we already have the numbers. So there's a tip for maybe speeding this up.
So look at the data that you've already got and see if you can see any trends in there that gives you some disconfirming evidence on your
Yeah,
hypothesis.
there's loads of examples I've got on that guide.
So we think that people don't look for disconfirming evidence, partly because they're not trained to. As you say, that's not something that we tend to come up through a standard education route. And, maybe if you're a scientist, it's different, but if you're not a scientist, you may not have come across it. We know it feels great when we come up with a good idea and everyone goes, oh, wow, that's a fabulous idea. And we don't want to then pour cold water on that. And then there's, I suppose, the other side of that, which is actually, if Damion, you come up with a great idea, I don't want to feel like I'm pouring cold water on your idea by saying, well, what disconfirming evidence do you have as well? So there's a lot here going on from the social perspective too, isn't there?
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely. And that's why I think when organizations, particularly leadership teams, can pick up on this model and they can start using it with their people, that can completely change the dynamic and the culture within the organization. Because people stop talking about, so and so should have all the answers,
Mm.
and instead the conversation starts to become, what theories have we tested? How can we test this theory that we've had? And maybe put a stop to these, what sometimes feel like endless discussions or debates on whether this thing's going to work or not.
Yeah.
Okay. Instead of saying, how do we go and test it?
Mm-hmm.
How do we go and do a rapid test so we can get the learning out and have some confidence as to what to do next? Because really, until it's tested, who knows? Who can know? Who can possibly have all the answers? It just logically doesn't make any sense.
And the change as well, once you are testing, is you're not testing for proof that it works. You're testing for proof that it doesn't work.
Yeah, you're looking for something that says maybe we've got it wrong here. Yeah, and if we have, we come back around. We reject that hypothesis, or we adapt it. So which means we tweak it slightly. We test it again. And if we reject, we come back around to say, well, what other theories have we not yet tested? There must be an explanation here somewhere. We just haven't found it yet. That's what we need to be focused on, as opposed to, oh no, it failed, and get all miserable about it. So a client I was working with recently who had a quality issue in their process, and it was so this is a manufacturing-based example, but I think for those that are not in manufacturing, it's easy enough to get your heads around. It was a paint shop, and they had a defect in the painted items afterwards that they called nips, like little tiny, almost like imperfections in the paint, which for them wasn't good enough for their standards. So, and they had a theory that what was causing this was airborne contaminants in their factory that they worked in. So there was many other processes in their factory which created dust, where people were sanding things down or grinding things. And so that was their top theory. That's what was causing this issue. So I tasked them then to say, well, how can we test that and look for disconfirming evidence to say it's not airborne contaminants that's causing this issue? And they came up with the answer. They said, well, why don't we come in early one day before these other processes have even started doing anything, and we'll paint some items. And if we still get nibs on them, then we haven't understood this correctly. So that's what they did. And these parts came out perfect.
Right.
So that said that theory they had about this airborne stuff, had it been wrong, we might have still seen nibs even in the early hours when there weren't other stuff going on. So that was their opportunity to say, can we disprove this? And I thought that was really quite ingenious of them to have come up with that way of testing it. Yeah. So that's I guess a real life application of this in terms of how you can use it.
Brilliant. Don't I feel like I could talk for hours on this subject. I think it's really interesting.
I think we probably could, yeah.
Thank you very much, Damion, for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find more episodes of our Uncommon Sense Tools to Improve Your Work Forever in our Knowledge Hub on our website, or, of course, your favourite podcast platform. And do subscribe so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode, where you'll find links to more content on this topic, which includes webinar recordings, toolbox guides, blogs, and infographics, and our training page. You can always drop us a line on team@pmi.co.uk and arrange a time to have a call to talk about how these tools can help you in your organisation. We'd really love to hear from you.